In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.
Hello, Sublation Media viewers. It's I, Douglas Lane, the head honcho here at Sublation Media, author of Fall Into Time and Last Week's Apocalypse, and a short story called The 84 Regress, which you can find in Last Week's Apocalypse. I'm also the co-host with Ashley Frawley. Ashley?
Hi, I'm Ashley Frawley, as you said. I'm a sociologist at the University of Kent. I'm a columnist at MCC. I'm a columnist at Compact, a visiting researcher at MCC Brussels, and a visiting researcher at the University of Kent. I'm the author of 2 books and over 100 articles on various topics in a wide range of media, and of course, journal articles and academic journals, that sort of thing. I've actually got a new article out that just came out 3 days ago about my new book. It's in the Journal of, I don't even know, International something.
I'll rush out to the newsstand to buy that journal.
Terrible.
That's my favorite journal.
If you go to Google Scholar and my name, it should be the most recent article that I have published. Anyways, so I'm apologies. I wasn't here last week. I was at the Battle of Ideas. I am exhausted. I couldn't even get out of bed this morning. I was so exhausted. And I spent I also gave myself permission to just spend the day at the British Museum, which I never do. When I travel, I just, I'm writing and whatever I'm doing. And I was like, I'm just going to go to the British Museum. It's wonderful. So over on my podcast, I'm going to have an episode called What the Ancient Egyptians Can Teach Us About Bitcoin. Inspired. Well, not inspired. I was thinking about this for a while, but I was quite obsessed with all of the little, actually up close and personal with some of the very first coins that were ever struck. So it was a lot of fun. And then someone on my Patreon commented, "Oh, it's just like business secrets of the pharaohs." And I was like, "Oh no." Peep show. Anyway, so that's what's going on with me and my channel. But with Sublation, this week we're looking at Elon Musk, how oligarchs are controlling America. And to prepare for this, I read a couple of biographies, I should say hagiographies, of Elon Musk. And what they reminded me of was, in Back to the Future, where, in one of the sequels where Biff is like, I don't know, mayor or something like that. And it was like, there was some video that was playing. I'm vaguely remembering, this has been years, and it was like, and Biff, this is how Biff, the genius of Biff, he managed to do this and this and this. And that's what it was like. It was like, wow, if this person is very, very rich, it must be because they are a unique genius. And that was kind of the tone of these biographies that I was reading. And I found it kind of funny because it's a very similar, I remember on the eve of the 2008 financial crisis, when people had discovered all of these complex ways of loaning people money, and they thought, and I remember I was in the kitchen of my father's house in Canada visiting, and CBC radio was playing, as it perpetually was. And I remember, and our next guest is going to talk about how we will never see another economic crisis. And it comes, and I don't remember who the guest was, but it was like, yes, thanks, Bob. We've figured it out. We've solved the problems, and we will never see another economic crisis. I remember that. And so all of these people were congratulating themselves that they had figured out new ways to make money. And they thought they were not just lucky, they were good. And that's what happens, I think, in our culture. We think if someone has a whole bunch of money, it must be because there's something unique about them. It is not that they are lucky. It is that they are good. There must be something special. And if we could just emulate that something special. But as I was reading, I was like, well, shit, there are a lot of people who are, jerks to their employees and whatever, all these special, unique gifts and risk takers. And yet, I don't know, they're maybe not heirs to gold mines or whatever, or gem mines or whatever it is, or, endless capital, then lucked out on selling an early company. Now, I don't want to be too much of a jerk about Elon Musk. There are people out there who really like him and think that he's quite useful to the world. And I do have to say that some of the statements that he makes about the future, like the future will be great and all these sorts of things, they're missing from our culture, and we do need some of that just to give you some balance. But Doug, what were you thinking when you set this, when you decided that we should talk about this week?
Well, I was just thinking about how Elon Musk is one billionaire amongst a few who have had an influence on our politics. And I know he's been singled out as a very threatening figure lately. There have been a couple of articles written, one in Der Spiegel and the other in the Atlantic. Um, and from the covers and the headlines, I haven't managed to get my hands on these articles. The claim seems to be that if Trump is elected in November, Elon Musk will run America and, by extension, run the world. This is his big bid for power by supporting Trump. Trump is like a Trojan horse for the true power, which is Elon Musk. And in a lot of the world, for instance, in Ukraine, politics really are just run by oligarchs, and they select candidates to represent their interests and put them into power to do their bidding. Um, and I just thought, well, it might be worthwhile to consider how billionaires are made and and what their role is in the United States society. So the thing that I came up with, doing a quick, just a bit of research, a quick skim of the material, is that for the most part, billionaires are made through government contracts. Um, they rely on government contracts, subsidies, low interest loans, um, tax breaks, which is another form of subsidy, in order to become billionaires. In Elon's case, he got his start, as far as I can tell, with PayPal. That's where he made his first 100 million. Was when PayPal was sold to eBay.
Yeah.
And PayPal was born out of the merger of Confinity, which was a Peter Thiel effort, and something called, guess what it was called? It was Elon's. It's called X.
Oh, it was called X. Yes,
X.com.
of course. Sorry.
Yeah. So, but it wasn't the X we know today. It was a digital currency company, and they were both Confinity and X.com were aimed at creating digital financial institutions, or a digital financial institution that would make moving money online easy. Early investors included Deutsche Bank, Nokia Ventures, and a company called Cybercash. Cybercash had received an exemption to U.S. law that made it that the law made it illegal to provide encryption technology outside the United States, but Cybercash received an exemption to that law. So the state played a role in the creation of PayPal. It sort of was picking winners and losers by giving that exemption, I would say. So just to begin with, what I would note is that by and large, you don't get to be making that first $1 billion without state help. You don't just go out
Well,
and say, "Oh, I've created a pet rock. Everyone wants it, and now I'm a billionaire." I mean, there are some exceptions, but if you're going to run a multi-billion-dollar company, you generally need government contracts.
yeah. Well, what's interesting too is that it's not just the state, and actually, a lot of what is happening with the technologies that are being unleashed at the moment has a potential to undermine state power in the long run, because they undermine the legitimacy of a state and its ability to protect people. So, for example, if a state can't protect people from another virus, as another one will almost certainly come, uh, um, it may lose a large part of its legitimacy. Or if we have like AI generated, I don't know, what's the word I'm looking for? Not hacking. That sounds so old. Like undermining of security systems, that sort of thing, and states wind up being powerless against that. Then the states stand to lose a lot. But what's interesting is you mentioned Deutsche Bank, and Deutsche Bank also has there's a whole story to be told about Deutsche Bank's role in Trump's coming to power, which I'm sure, I don't know, probably Americans are more aware of this than people in Europe were. But Deutsche Bank was trying to gain legitimacy in the United States. And part of that was securing a big, at the time, Trump was on the Apprentice, and he's this big TV star. And by securing this big figure as a client, that was a big part of their legitimacy. So they wound up giving him these huge loans, even though he was like radioactive to everybody else because he kept defaulting on loans. So they agreed, even though he was a huge risk. And I don't remember how much it was, like 330 million or something that they gave him, with a really low interest rate. And as you say, securing this kind of cheap credit is a huge part of how these people become billionaires, because then they just, they use credit to then invest in other things and so on, and they're able to leverage themselves. But anyway, so Deutsche Bank got screwed in the end because he didn't. He obviously wouldn't pay back these loans. But it's interesting that Deutsche Bank also had a role to play in Elon Musk's coming to power. So I wonder if there's some kind of article to be written about that. But, they have a very, very long history of unscrupulous practices, very famously being one of the big funders of the Nazis.
Mm-hmm.
So anytime you see Deutsche Bank, you're like, oh, shit. Whatever's happening here cannot be particularly good. But anyways, yes. But again, this is the sort of thing that once you're up there with the big guys, this is, people will throw money at you. And I've seen people, wasn't there like that famous viral clip of some woman who's like, money just makes more money. You just put them together, go, and they make more money, babies, this sort of thing. I was like, yeah, when you're already rich, that's kind of how it feels. Or when people have a good deal of money and they do affirmations and things like that, and they get into things like The Secret, and they become quite occult. Because for them, money just appears like magic, where for the rest of us, it feels so damn real. There's our viral clips are the ones where that woman's in the supermarket, or I think she's in a drugstore, I don't know, in Canada, Shoppers Drug Mart, I think it is. And she's like looking at all the little makeup products, and she's like, ooh, a face mask. Is that worth 2 hours of my life? No, I don't think so. Oh, look at this. A moisturizer, $18. That's worth this amount of my life. I think I'll get it, that sort of thing. It feels, there's just this random person in a store has this very concrete understanding that this thing in front of her is worth this much of her existence. Whereas you have the ultra rich being like, I must just be great. God has chosen me. I have a uniquely as an individual, there must be just something about me, or my money just comes together and I just do my affirmations and I attract good things. Cause that's what it feels like to these sorts of people. And it's, one area that I find very, very interesting toward the present is just the degree of alienation that we're experiencing in capitalism, of money, of the very rich, of, things like cryptocurrencies, this sort of thing, just how far off into the world of imagination our superstructural sort of elements are, how alienated everything is, that they can imagine that really all that matters is psychology, your belief in something, your specialness as an individual, this sort of thing. Maybe I'm being too vague here, but I was thinking that's what I've been thinking about at the moment, just inspired by a dinner conversation with somebody who mentioned that he was investing in Bitcoin, like little by little trying to buy a Bitcoin. And I was like, that sounds like the stupidest thing I've ever heard in my life. And but I started to think about it, like this sort of like random person is starting to invest in this stuff. The avenues for productive investment must be dwindling hugely. The reality is going to assert itself in an extremely explosive and terrifying way soon. Go on.
Well, I just want to show a clip, actually, because there's a new way to get rich quick, and that is to register to vote in Pennsylvania. Here.
So I have a surprise for you, which is that we're going to be awarding $1 million to randomly to people who have signed the petition every day from now until the election. So, one of the challenges we're having is like, well, how do we get people to know about this petition? Because the legacy media won't report on it. Not everyone's on X. So I figure, how do we get people to know about it? Well, this news, I think, is going to really fly. So every day between now and the election, we'll be awarding $1 million, starting tonight. All right. So, tonight's person is John Dreyer. Yeah.
All right. So there are new ways always coming up. If you just affirm the secret, if you just say your daily affirmation, I guess it's not registered to vote, but sign the Liberty petition that Elon has put out there, you too could become a millionaire, Ashley, just like that guy in the MAGA hat. But what you won't become is a billionaire, because what you have to do to become a billionaire, again, is, for the most part, unless you're like J.K. Rowling or someone like that, or you make Barbie, and even then, I don't think the director or any of them became a billionaire. It made $1 billion. But what you need is some subsidies. In Elon's case, Tesla received $465 million in form of a loan from the Advanced Technology Vehicle Manufacturing Loan Program in 2008. So it was Obama's effort to incentivize the creation of electric vehicles, not electronic, but electric vehicles, so vehicles that ran on electricity, that gave Elon his big break, even as Tesla wasn't particularly profitable and was priced out of the range of most consumers. He received nearly $500 million in loans to get his plants going and to start developing Tesla. There are a variety of ways in which, the billionaires and the U.S. state are interdependent. And this is all coming out of neoliberalism. We think of neoliberalism as the privatization of the state losing power, but in reality, the state has shifted some of its responsibilities to the private sector, but it hasn't shifted the responsibility for funding entirely to the private sector. These are giant subsidies for the rich, and all of these billionaires are already mingled with the state. They are state actors. SpaceX, or whatever it's called, Elon's version of NASA, it receives a ton of subsidies from the U.S. state. This is a privatization of NASA, but it's also still a state effort. So we should keep that in mind when we think about all of these different billionaires and their relationship to the different capitalist parties.
Yeah, I was thinking about this as well in relation to this idea of the famous socialism for the rich, capitalism for the poor. So, when people complain about their horrible lives, like, well, I never promised you a rose garden. Like, capitalism doesn't promise you anything. What are you complaining about? But the rich live in a kind of communist utopia. No, not communist, socialist utopia. So they are able to socialize their losses. They get enormous amounts of revenue from the state or investment. And they also live in the wonderland where they can work if they want to, but they don't have to. They don't have to work in order to maintain the kind of image of the tech genius, the chosen individual who deserves these things. A lot of them do, Musk famously, but they don't have to. And that's kind of the world that we would like to create. And as I was reading about, Musk's kind of ventures and the risks that he was taking, it was interesting because he was kind of like he almost kind of ran out of money, but he was able to take these enormous risks because he was willing to take enormous losses. So we'll just, most companies they'll be quite risk averse. Not most, yeah, I think probably most companies will be quite risk averse. So, car companies will test their cars for I don't know, like 1,000,000 miles or something like that. Whereas Musk okayed his some of his first vehicles after like very short tests, and he let the production run go even as they were still troubleshooting. So then when they found problems, this cost a huge amount of money because then they had to go and troubleshoot on the go, and they also had to as the cars were being produced, and they had to allow customers to send the cars back to be fixed for problems that were discovered, in the course of actually running them. So there was a lot of risk that was taken, and they paid the consequences in the sense of consumer dissatisfaction and the risk that the company would be associated with a poor safety record, that kind of thing. And not only just a poor safety record for consumers, but that they had many, many more worker injuries than other companies because they were, but he was taking risks because he was willing to incur enormous losses. And I think actually we do want a world in which we use our resources to take risks for purposes that would be good for humanity in the long run. And this is the sort of rational kernel in a person like Musk, in that he has a kind of, oh, and I know people will get on my case for like celebrating Musk here, but I hope that I buffered this enough. But there's a rational kernel in this, in that he's willing to take these kinds of risks that cowardly capitalists generally are not. So when a lot of companies rely on the government, it's like to socialize their losses, or when they're trying to make profits, they'll do things like buybacks and all sorts of things that don't actually produce anything good in the world. They become very risk averse in terms of what they produce. And they'll be unwilling to create new products. It's a lot better to, invest in like giving people debt. Individual investors also less willing to invest in actually making things in the world. And I use this example all the time, but like, why would you start a new shoe company when you have to compete with Nike, who's been making shoes for however many decades and has an incredibly complex system of production? They've got a foot in the market. They know how to market what they're doing. And you might be able to compete against Nike, but you might not. And it would cost a humongous amount up front. And it's going to take you a really long time to make that money back, because immediately you're going to have to reach the level that Nike is, unless you have some revolutionary new system in production or distribution or whatever it might be. And some people do, you still see this sort of thing, but the incentive to do so is much, much less. It is a lot more profitable to give people debt, or to give people student debt that they have to pay back. And so you get these bubbles all over the place. So the university is quite famously a very big bubble, where people are just pouring a ton of money in, and it's going to burst, because eventually the reality of the situation, the reality of the linkage, and I don't know, I have to think this through a little bit more, but I'm going to say this for now, and I may think this through in the future. But at least the way that it seems to me now, the reality of the linkage between all of those symbols in the imaginary world of psychological value and blah, 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 the reality of the material nature of value will assert itself when people have to pay back those loans with something material in the world, their own labor, but they're not able to do that because they can't get a job, because nothing new is being produced. And they're being replaced by all sorts of even new kinds of machines that are taking over white collar jobs, a new wave of white collar jobs that doesn't seem to be being made up for anywhere else. At least when there was a wave of machines, more and more complex machinery in industrial production, people were going into white collar jobs. Now you see white collar jobs, supposedly, that's the prediction, being taken over by more and more automation. And so there's nothing really to take that up. So the reality of the situation at least ought to assert itself. But anyways, so But in an ideal world, you should be able to. I mean, we have so many resources, so many human minds that can think and hands that can create, so much possibility. So we've gone so far technologically that it is possible to solve some of these problems. And Musk's great benefit is his hubris and his willingness to incur losses, although obviously he's able to incur these losses because he's cushioned in all these ways we've just discussed. But at least it's a lot different from other companies. And I think in an ideal world, or the world that we wish to move forward to, we would actually be able to take these risks, cushioned hopefully by
Mhm.
resources available to society being made use of much, much more effectively. And I think generally within capitalism, we are regressing away from that toward a kind of investment in bubbles and fictitious forms of capital, and a shying away from like infrastructure projects, because why would you invest in infrastructure, right? Like infrastructure famously, and this is why the state often builds it. Take for instance during COVID, if you were building all these roads and all, like, we were in New York, and I remember looking outside the building that we were staying in, and there were office towers all around us, and every single one of them was empty. Like that is just an enormous wasted cost, because infrastructure tends to it's quite solid, but all that is solid melts into air, right? And so there's less and less incentive to do these sorts of things. And I just think, I don't know, there's something good about being willing to actually build things and solve problems and incur risks in order to do that, and to sometimes and to I don't know, for profit to I don't want to say be less important, because it's always going to be the most important thing, right? But to be at least he's sort of willing to incur losses in pursuit of some greater objective, if I could say. But as I said, because he's cushioned, I don't know. Make what you will of that.
Well, I mean,
It was a
that's
bit
sort of the story of all these subsidies, right? The government allows for these big capitalists to invest in risky projects because the government itself is the backstop. But the biggest risk that Elon has been taking lately is political, and I'm glad to know that you are, an advocate for his risk taking, and that you're getting on the Trump train. Here we go. This is the latest thing.
So many different great things. Where is he? Come on up here, Elon. He created the first major American car company in generations, and his rocket company is the only reason we can now send American astronauts into space. Come here. Take over, Elon. Yes, take over.
Hi, everyone. As you can see, I'm not just MAGA, I'm dark MAGA.
Okay. All right. So that was Elon at a Trump rally. And that is his latest risky venture, is to give away, $1 million a day to these people signing the petition to financially back Trump, to turn X or Twitter into a pro-Trump, algorithmically determined pro-Trump social media platform. These are all the big moves that Elon is making, and let's not deceive ourselves. That's exactly what his free speech platform is. It's a Trump propaganda machine.
Or a himself propaganda machine. That's why I kept saying for such a long time that the left should not abandon free speech, because these people are opportunists. As soon as it doesn't suit them, immediately they turn. I keep saying that. Stop with the symbolic politics and the coercive policy making, and and also taking the opposite side, because when of your enemy, because when they get power, they will do the same fucking thing to you. Excuse my French. Sorry, I interrupted you, Doug. Carry on.
No. But it's worth noting that Trump. His relationship with Elon is not that different from, say, Kamala Harris's relationship with a variety of billionaires, including the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. If I go through a list of the billionaires I just Googled up, Jeff Bezos donated to the Democrats and to bipartisan organizations. David Ellison, the son of Larry Ellison, who's a Trump backer right now, gave $1 million to Biden. Bill and Melinda Gates give big money to the DNC. Mark Zuckerberg gave $500 million to the Democratic Party in 2020, backing Biden. Perhaps not entirely intentionally. I think maybe his wife was responsible for that. But in any case, he did that, and and now he's beginning to regret it. And I love the video clip, so I'm gonna do another video clip here.
And Mark Zuckerberg has said that he will not spend any money in the 2024 U.S. election cycle. In a letter to the U.S. House Judiciary Committee, Meta CEO said that he will not repeat the 2020 efforts to fund local elections. Zuckerberg told the committee that the White House was wrong to pressure Facebook on COVID content. The contributions, which were designed to be non-partisan, were accused of being unfairly distributed between left-leaning and right-leaning areas. Republicans had criticized the funding efforts as Zuckerbucks. Zuckerberg also said that senior Biden administration officials repeatedly pressured Meta, the parent company of Facebook and Instagram, to censor content in 2021 during the COVID pandemic. In his letter, Zuckerberg said that the government pressure was wrong and regrets that Meta were not more outspoken. House Judiciary Republicans touted the letter as a big win for free speech. Zuckerberg's letter comes at a crucial time in the U.S. presidential election race, with Kamala Harris and Donald Trump neck and neck in the polls.
All right, so the question we should ask ourselves, I guess, right now is, why is it that the billionaire class, these people built up by neoliberalism, are to some degree or another shifting away from both the old Republicans, the neocons, and the Democrats, who have become one to a large extent, and in hoping for, or at least being willing to place some of their bets on Trump. I think we would be misguided to look at Elon as unique, or as a billionaire who is interfering in U.S. politics in a way that is not the norm. I mean, his methods are a little bit more amateur and crass, and someone said that he's trying to turn the U.S. election into a Mr. Beast video, and that's new. But giving lots of money to a political campaign is not new. And so what we should wonder is, what does it mean that the neoliberal state itself, because these people should be considered basically integrated into the neoliberal state, is placing some of its bets on the big populist Trump revolution. I'm not sure what it means exactly, but when we ask that question, we should remember that neoliberalism was cast as kind of laissez-faire politics. It was like a return to entrepreneurialism and the private sector, but in fact, it was not. It was none of those things, right? So whatever we're getting now will not be what it's billing itself as exactly. It will not be a complete break from what came before.
No, and you just get different flavors of what came before, it seems to me. You get a kindly version of neoliberalism that says, well, really, it's for your best interest that you should do this and that. And, oh, you're not doing the right thing. I will now create frameworks within which you must do the right thing. And now, okay, now there will be consequences, but they are for the best, And then you have a kind of crass version of that still will seek to control speech and different aspects of everyday life when it hurts the bottom line. Always, political freedom is used opportunistically by these people because they really don't like it. They don't like, their interests are opposed to the vast majority achieving political freedom, and their interests are always in the realm of economic freedom, that they want to do what they need to do to try to get over the contradictions that they are seeing in their world. And we are trying to do what we need to do politically to overcome the contradictions in our world. And in order for them to win, they have to shut down that political side of that contradiction. But it's always going to be, you have a choice between the person who's gonna, I why do I always think of the most crass metaphors? I'm very sorry, but you've got the person who's going to, I'll use a better one. Do you know that famous viral cartoon that went around where there's a billboard and there's a wolf on it, and it's like, I'm going to eat you, and all the sheep are like, well, he tells it like it is. It's kind of like a bit like that, right? Or you can have the person who will tell you you're beautiful before fucking you. But at the end of the day, that's kind of what they want, right? They're all wolves. Just one decided to unzip the suit, essentially. And that's kind of our world. And we can be kind of silly in imagining that is our political spectrum. But of course, the side of the political spectrum that once dedicated itself to pushing past all of this, to achieving real economic and political freedom for the great mass of society, that side of the political spectrum has entirely collapsed. Because a lot of people have seen the kindly neoliberalism and the mitigation of worst possible scenarios, like destitution and so on, being saved from, we're saved a little bit from destitution by a social safety net, but this of course is nobody's aspiration. It's a worst case scenario. We're so beaten down that we actually aspire to that. So we will cry and whine about the destruction of the welfare state, which is fair enough. We should cry and whine about it, but that's not the end of our horizons. That's just the worst case scenario, but we wind up begging for that because we have been so cowed, and any kind of political opposition has been so destroyed that is the horizon of our ambitions. Can't we just have someone who will speak to us nicely while they fuck us? Like, that's it. That's become kind of the aspiration of the left. And then if you really want to rebel against that because you see that what the left has become is awful and really doesn't have your interests at heart, but is just trying to secure for you a worst case scenario, where do you go? You've got nowhere to go. You're going to go to the right because they seem to be the enemy of that awful, smug ruling class. But they too are just, they're the mask off ruling class. Well, there you go. There are your choices. And and America's in a much more of a terrible stalemate because you've got this sort of two-party system that is absolutely impossible to budge. And at least in some places, there is a possibility for outsiders to come in. But even when outsiders come in, this is a sort of populist revolt. But even when outsiders come in, they still wind up, they'll say all the right things, at least the right things to, tell the masses, I'm not one of those. I'm not one of the smug, NGO class types. I'm here to tell it like it is or whatever. When they get into power, they're on the phone to Brussels or they're on the phone to their donors or to the capitalists or whatever. It's, don't worry, nothing will change. And please inject some optimism here, Doug, because it can get quite depressing.
Yeah. Well, I want to inject some optimism and say that, under capitalism, the only thing worse than being exploited is not being exploited.
Mm-hmm.
While it's true that profit is king in the capitalist system, those profits still rely upon employing people, at least enough people to produce enough value to keep the system turning over, even in a financialized way. So when we think about what's happening now, if we try to imagine that what's happening now indicates some kind of political and economic change, that it's not merely a continuity of the same kinds of exploitation and ideological neoliberal manipulation that we've known for our entire lives, but rather is a shifting in a new direction. We shouldn't expect that change to capitalism within capitalism to be what we need in order to overcome our society, which is filled with contradictions and inequalities and authoritarian tendencies and so on, we should at very least note it and see if there are opportunities within the change. You know, I think it's worth understanding that neither part, just to go back to an earlier point, neither party is independent of big capital, because both parties are vying to control the state, and the state and big capital are one and the same. So the question is, what factions within big capital are they appealing to, and where are the fraction, where are the divisions within those factions? Because big tech is one faction that is supporting both candidates. Kamala Harris's campaign has raised $1 billion. Now they say that a lot of that money actually came from small donors. However, there's some evidence that Act Blue, which is the organization that facilitates small donations for the Democrats, the Act Blue is simply channeling big donor donations through a list of small donors, creating phony donations to create a phony paper trail in order to get a lot of cash into the campaign quickly. It all started to happen right after Kamala Harris became the nominee. And there's some evidence of a few small donors who have basically like an old lady who lives on Social Security who gave like tens of thousands of dollars to Kamala Harris all of a sudden, like multiple small donations that added up to like $30,000 or some crazy amount. That was just something that has not been fully investigated, and I would just say that's an allegation. But this is known as smurfing. I would say that both parties are reliant on the neoliberal billionaires at the moment, and the question remains: like, why would Elon take this big risk of putting all of his chips behind the second term for the clown? What is going on here? It does look, if you look at the real clear polling averages right now, that Trump is on track to be the president again. If these, I mean, it's all within the margin of error, so it's a coin flip really, but he's leading by, a point, 2 points in the swing states. So, rather than demonizing Elon, we should note how, as a representative of big tech and big capital and the neoliberal state, he is placing a bet in a slightly different direction, and ask ourselves why. What do you think?
I don't know. And I think that's such an interesting question. I'm not going to be able to answer it off the top of my head. I'd have to take like a week to think about it. But off the top of my head, I would say that, going back to this sort of like the different colors of the capitalist class, the different costumes that they wear, whatever metaphor you want to use. I can see, like, for me, people like Trump and Musk, they want to make capitalism be what they think it is. And I think cryptocurrency and that sort of thing is another similar kind of thing of like having the audacity to make capitalism be what they think it is. So bourgeois economics thinks that, money is subjective, value is subjective. So let's create a currency that is totally untethered from anything real and have it be almost entirely subjective. I think that's fascinating, fucking crazy, and going to collapse horribly, but very, very interesting. These attempts to kind of make the world be what it is in their minds, what it's supposed to be, what the promise of capitalism was for them. So, they're like, well, why don't we, go to Mars? Musk is like, why don't we go to Mars? Why don't we build spaceships? Because this is the thing that capitalism was promising, right? That this is a very productive system and great, and it's going to make the future great. Like, who says that anymore, right? So it's this old kind of ideology of capitalism that was very optimistic that we let go of because we didn't have to have it anymore once the Berlin Wall came down. There was no reason anymore to say that capitalism was better, right? That was its legitimacy. It was like, look how impoverished they are. People in the DDR don't even have bananas. In our wonderful world, we've got Coca-Cola and all the bananas you can eat. We don't even want to eat bananas anymore. This is how great our world is. So then you have the fall of the Berlin Wall, and capitalism doesn't have to legitimate itself anymore. And so they're sort of drawing on this much older kind of, and it makes sense because Trump is like a used car salesman from 1982 or whatever. So he's like very pre new era of cowardly capitalism. So he's still stuck in this sort of mantra. People often joke like whatever you thought was cool when you were 30 is just gonna be cool forever. That's the way Trump is. Like whatever was the cool thing about capitalism, he thinks it's like that forever. And in some ways it becomes kind of refreshing. And there's an undercurrent as well of like nostalgia for the Cold War, because that's when capitalism had legitimacy. And even like the war between Russia and Ukraine had a kind of Cold War kind of nostalgia to it, because all the other conflicts that we had were like, yeah, that, we can't really demonize Muslims because they're our neighbors and they're American citizens and so on. And it's like, well, I don't know that many Russians hanging around. I mean, sure there are any, but there we go. There's an enemy that we can really get behind. And you could see when the tanks were rolling in, I remember Sky News, they were like, and here we have the Soviet tanks moving in. Someone said that. And I was like, oh, see, this is the conflict you wish we could have. So there's a sense like of resurgence of this desire for capitalism to have meaning, to have legitimacy, to be going somewhere. And when you are stuck in a world of horrible pessimism, that does feel really, really powerful. So that's that one side, that kind of like old style of capitalism that they are trying to make real in the world. And that'll be very interesting when the reality bites, what's going to happen with that. But it's fascinating for that reason. But on the other side, you have the capitalists who know that it is not what they said it was. They know that capitalism is not that. Or they feel it, or they're aware of it. And they have been busily attempting for at least since the early 1990s to lower people's expectations. And that was kind of the great win against the Soviet Union, that you no longer had to kind of legitimate a system that really wasn't going anywhere. In some ways, it was a bad thing because capitalism lost its legitimacy to a certain extent. On the other hand, it was a good thing because, well, you could say things like, it's not a great system, but it's better than all the other systems, right? That became like the thing that people would say. People would just kind of admit, yeah, it's terrible, but everything else is worse, right?
Mhm.
And so they have the ideology for those capitalists on that side, and that brand of neoliberalism was lowering and attenuating people's expectations that the future isn't going to be good. The future is actually going to be terrible. And we should accept that, and that it is quite progressive to accept that. That became the new kind of political spectrum of like, accept that capitalism will not deliver the goods, but there isn't any alternative. And you have a responsibility as a good citizen to accept less for the planet, for future generations, for whatever. You have a responsibility to accept less. That became the new ideology of capitalism. And what they're doing is they're pushing back against that. And we will probably see in the very near future why that side of the capitalist class was trying to lower people's expectations, because value is not just subjective. There's a material basis for these things. There's a reason why there was stagnation, why the capitalists started to try to justify that stagnation on the basis of like zero growth and environmentalist policies surrounding who cares about economic growth anyway? It's not like they had all this growth at their fingertips and they're just puppet masters and they could make money, rain from the sky. It's that growth wasn't happening. There was stagnation, at least not at a sufficient rate. And they had to justify that. And Musk and Trump are like a thorn in their side because they are stuck in a world in which they want capitalism to be what it used to say that it was. And it can't be that. It can't be that anymore.
I want to push back on this. This is a pushing back on my own view that from 4 years ago. In 2020, I had a big Facebook argument with Chris Catrone because Chris Catrone said, if Trump is reelected, we will see a recovery from our economic problems in America. And I just thought, come on, that's insane, right? I mean, I lived through 2008. I read Capital. I learned about the declining rate of profit. I read Michael Roberts' blog about the long depression. And I thought, no, well, Chris is just being completely, well, first of all, he sounds like a troll, like a Republican. And secondly, he's just ignoring the fundamentals here. But then you have to remember about time scales and how capitalism works through crisis. And so I would say the way you described the neoliberal ideology is historically correct. In other words, since 2008, certainly, and perhaps since 2001, neoliberalism has said those kinds of things to us. But neoliberalism arrived on the scene through Carter, but really ideologically through Ronald Reagan, who promised morning in America, jobs, prosperity, the chance for everyone to be their own entrepreneur.
That's why I said
and
shades of neoliberalism.
Right. Well, but the point is that these things change over time. It's not just that it's one thing or another, or not that it's everything at once, but what's emphasized changes over time. You know, the old Fordist approach was dying during the Carter years, and that was when he gave his crisis of confidence speech in 1979, where he said there's a malaise on America. We all need to tighten our belts, you know, that kind of thing. That was 1979. Reagan came along and said, no, it's morning in America. You can have prosperity. And, you know, the prosperity gospel became big in Christian churches. And so we should keep in mind that, yes, there's a tendency and a trend towards for profit rates to decline and for crisis to emerge. But neoliberalism worked on its own terms. It created 20 years of not completely uninterrupted, but mostly of prosperity for the majority. Reaganism was defined by economic success. Clintonism, even the Clinton era, even more so. The roaring 90s is how they're remembered. I lived through them in my 20s and thought that we were suffering a great recession and I couldn't get ahead. And all of Gen X thought we were looking forward to a future that would be worse than our parents. And we were right. But nonetheless, the 90s were a success. And so now we're on the verge of a change, possibly. Possibly not. It's a coin flip. But what does The Economist say right now? The Economist magazine on the 19th. They say the American economy has left other rich countries in the dust. Expect that to continue, argues Simon Rabinovich and Henry Kerr. They say American productivity still leads the world. They say the shale revolution will make America's economy great. They say the American stock market will continue to reign supreme. They say that the yuan is nowhere close to displacing the greenback. And then they ask a question: what can stop the American economy now? So, so
well, I don't know. I've heard that one before, Doug.
I know, but I'm saying, as Marxists, while we shouldn't accept that these kinds of solutions and ideologies are going to actually lift the working class up out of being the propertyless class and overcome all the contradictions within society and help us achieve a transformation that we were aiming at, we should accept that capitalism solves these problems to some degree ideologically and has managed to keep plugging along. There was the welfare state and Fordism, which was no great solution. It didn't help everyone. It was unequal. And there was still poverty. There was certainly still exploitation, but it did create, the consumer society and a kind of opulence which no one had seen before. Then there was the neoliberal turn, which wasn't great. It was really uneven. There was a stratification of society, but there also was a feeling of possibility. People were buying homes that couldn't afford them, in the early 2000s. There was a continuation of the consumer society, and the roaring 90s happened. And now we've had like 15 years of recession and doldrums and problems. And we should not assume that the capitalist system and politics is just going to keep going exactly how we've experienced it for another 15, 20, 30 years. It is conceivable that we're going to experience the kind of boom that the 90s were, which is not, like, again,
Boom is
for
coming.
the left, a Gen Xer. Huh?
You think a
What did you
boom
say?
is coming?
I think a kind of boom. I think it's possible that some sort of boom might come. At least, in the same way that a boom happened in the 90s. Not like there wasn't a sense of like, oh, everyone's getting rich, but there were moments where if you wanted a job, you could get one. There were moments where it was a good idea to put money in the stock market. There was a big tech bubble. It all popped, and what they did in the 90s led to 2008, right?
Mhm.
So I'm not saying it's going to last forever. I'm just saying they can create 10, 15-year bubbles. They can mitigate against these contradictions, and we should think about that as we consider what's going to come next.
Yeah. Do you remember back in the day, Brendan Cooney in one of his videos quoted an Onion headline that was like "Masses clamor for new bubble"?
Yeah.
Well, I certainly hope. I mean, I hope that they can, right? And this is the thing with COVID. In 2019, I was telling my students we're going to have another crisis soon. Like they never really solve crises. They kick the can down the road, and they create the conditions for new and even bigger crises. And the underlying phenomena that led to the last crisis were never really dealt with. And so I had been expecting another crisis. And when COVID hit, and there was massive capital destruction, like small businesses going out of business, this kind of thing. And there were enormous government bailouts in the form of COVID money that was being given, for having workers laid off, that sort of thing, for a short period of time. And I've talked about this before, but if you look at some of the lobby records from that time, companies were not lobbying for business as usual. They were lobbying for lockdowns, and they were lobbying for aid packages, essentially bailouts, enormous bailouts. And I did think at the time, well, that's not great, but surely that's a lot better than a war, which is also a fantastic way of creating capital destruction and destruction of workers and that kind of thing. And so I thought, well, they might be getting fucking creative here. And the thing is that war has been one of the potential countervailing tendencies against crisis, against the falling rate of profit. But war became so potentially costly that nobody was willing, thankfully, to engage in country-on-country warfare for a very long time, which is why we had people in hiding behind states as opposed to being in states, right? So you couldn't have state-on-state warfare because of mutually assured destruction. And I'm seeing that resolve wear down, and it's scaring me quite a lot. But I have hoped that perhaps they will get creative and they will figure it out. They'll figure out a new bubble. They'll figure out some way of making our insane bean-based economy work, right? Because it's so I'm not sure how you were disagreeing with me, but I think that what you're saying is what I'm saying, that you have these people who are, this section of the capitalist class, and maybe the petty bourgeoisie, or what Marx called these like third persons or whatever, who kind of want to shore up. They see stagnation and they are out of ideas, and they want to they've naturalized it, like John Stuart Mill used to naturalize. He could see an end point to capitalist growth, and he was like, oh, well, it's probably just this harmonious, steady state that capitalism is naturally tending toward. So he naturalized it. And I think there's a certain portion of the capitalist class that is attempting to naturalize this, to dampen down people's expectations and get them to accept less, because they think that stagnation is a sort of natural equilibrium that capitalism is tending toward. And they're very frustrated and annoyed that people stubbornly want more. There's a section of the capitalist class that is like that. And they live in a dream world, in my opinion, that capitalism can exist in this harmonious sort of like steady state kind of reproduction over and over and over again. However, on the other side of that, on the other side of the capitalist class, there are these people who are trying to push through, who have the kind of, and I'm not defending them here, I'm just describing it, who have the audacity to try to push through and continue to attempt to create what that old model of capitalism had promised. And there are probably people who are trying to, I'm certain there are people who are trying to figure out how to create another bubble, because that's what capitalism is pretty great at. And I am just hoping that this can just carry on without blowing up the entire world. Because we don't have an alternative at the moment. So the best that we can do is hope for a new bubble and hope that the powers that be are creative enough to create one.
Well, I just want to close by saying something that I've been saying for a long time, and that I think you will agree with, which is that after the neoliberal turn, a good portion of the left became neo-Keynesians and wanted to return to the old Fordist welfare state, as if that was socialism, as if that was what needed to be protected and held on to. And that lasted all the way up through 2016, right? And 2020 even, with the Bernie Sanders campaigns, this desire to return to the previous form of capitalist management and the previous ideology. We are now faced with the choice between trying to hold on to neoliberalism, or accepting that there has been a change and critiquing and understanding that, not by referencing what came before as better, but by seeing where it points, how it could be transformed.
Exactly. And I think because
socialism.
Yes. Because nobody knows what the way forward is. Everybody wants, and the way forward looks terrifying, because it means that we have to figure it out and take responsibility for the solutions that we come up with. Socialism having worked out pretty badly in the past, you have to take responsibility for that possibility. Nobody really wants to do that. So the temptation is, and also capitalism has produced horrible things in the past, and nobody really wants to take responsibility for that either. So the temptation is to look back in the past for some moment when things seem to work. Right. So, well, that was fine. Everything was fine in blank decade. Why don't we go back to that? Well, back in the 50s, we used to blank. Why don't we go back to that? Everybody wants to do that, but you can't. There's this unrelenting pushing us forward, and we've got to understand its dynamics, or we are going to get, toppled underneath it or whatever, thrown under the feet of everyone else. But for the avoidance of any confusion, the last thing that I said, I'm not saying, oh, yay, let's hope for bubbles for eternity. I'm saying, well, because we haven't got a solution right now, I hope we can kick the can down the road, because our politics is in pretty bad disarray. But obviously, this cannot go on forever. It cannot go on forever. It's absolutely ludicrous to think that this is the end of all humanity, that this is it, that we will somehow figure out intelligent ways to create more bubbles, or kill just this many people every now and then, and destroy just this much capital every now and then. There's going to be something huge. And actually, one of the things that I was reading while I was preparing for this was that, I can't remember because I just skimmed a whole bunch of books, but one of the authors that I was reading said, well, the big problem with a lot of these tech oligarchs and and the technological revolutions that we're not even really grappling with the consequences of economically, so people are going to start losing faith in the state. People are going to start losing faith in government. And I was like, great. Because when that government tries to tell you to go sacrifice your life for it, you won't want to do it. And I think that's probably a good thing. Not probably, that's definitely a good thing. But will you want to sacrifice anything for anything? That's another question. I don't know.
Well, listen, we are 10 minutes over the hour. We are 10 minutes before the second, the
Sorry.
Parrot Room starts up. Please
Carry on
do
the
join us in the Parrot Room. And we're going to be talking about Rousseau. I'm hoping that Spencer Leonard will be there yet again. He always adds a lot to these discussions around Rousseau because he's very, I think he teaches this. Thank you all for watching. And again, go support us on Patreon. We are, as the election, closes in, we are trying to prepare for what will come next and lead the way for a campaign for socialism. So go help us out.
In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential